Hi, this is Keith Cunningham. I want to talk to you for a few minutes about a crisis survival guide. Five little birds are sitting side by side on a telephone wire. You shoot one of them, it falls off the wire and hits the ground. Now, how many birds are left on the wire? The obvious answer is four. The correct answer is none. When you shot the first bird, the other four flew off. All of us are experiencing an infestation of flying birds as a result of the COVID-19 virus and the ensuing economic crisis that it's generated. Although this is obvious, I'm going to say it anyway. This is not business as usual. In fact, if you haven't already, throw away your 2020 budget. Shred whatever strategic or growth plan you might have dreamed up 4 or 5 months ago for 2020. That strategic or growth plan will not help you survive this crisis, and survival and stability are the only new objectives. A great example might be the Titanic. The original plan of every passenger on the Titanic was to get from England to the United States, but that plan was radically changed the instant they hit that iceberg. After the iceberg, there wasn't one person on the Titanic who was thinking about what they were going to have for dinner once they got to New York. The change in priorities was dramatic because of the radical change in circumstances. Here's another example to help put things into perspective. Imagine that you're training to run in the Tokyo Olympics marathon. 3 months before the starting gun is fired, you get hit by a bus. Assume you are in the emergency room with a collapsed lung, two broken legs, and a real possibility of being paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of your life as a result of the encounter with the bus. The last thing you would be focused on is the dietary and training regimen you originally thought was required to compete in that race. Your priorities would logically shift to accommodate the new reality of your circumstances. You might be disappointed about missing the race, but as you're lying on the bedpan in the hospital, unable to wiggle your toes, it would not be your primary concern. During a crisis, your priorities and focus must shift from strategic to tactical. Think about an emergency room in a hospital. There are only two strategic outcomes: keep the patient alive and stabilize the vital signs. Everything else is tactical. Things like keeping the heart beating, stopping the bleeding, and keeping the oxygen flowing tactically support the primary objective of keeping the patient alive. In fact, if you take this analogy one step further, all of the monitors and machines hooked up to the patients are all intended to measure the things that, if they go wrong, will kill the patient. In an emergency room, they are not measuring your cholesterol or your body mass index because those things will not cause imminent death. If you really look at an emergency room, you'll find five recurring themes. Number one, extreme focus and a breathtaking level of intensity. Number two, constant monitoring of vital signs. Number three, instantaneous and constant communication. Number four, massive flexibility to respond to any new crisis that could destabilize or kill the patient. And number five, speed of action and interaction. If your business is experiencing financial turmoil, I would highly recommend you adopt the same protocols used in hospital emergency rooms. Prioritize keeping your business alive and getting it stabilized as quickly as possible. Keeping a business alive requires cash. The easiest thing to do right now would be to assume that the problem is COVID-19 or the government's response to COVID-19 or Wall Street's reaction to the government's response to COVID-19. The reality is that none of these are the real problem. Each of these are predicaments, or said another way, a state of environment. A problem is something that can be solved, and none of us individually can solve any of these predicaments. The real problem for us as business owners is, how do we save our business? How do we stabilize our business? How do we respond to this environment of the virus and quarantines and Wall Street seizing up by stabilizing our business in a way that gives us better than even odds that we will live to fight another day once these crises have passed? So here it is on a bumper sticker. Focus on the problem you can solve. If you had an underlying health condition prior to this virus, your ability to deal with this health crisis is compromised. The same is true with your business. If you have too much debt, or revenues were unstable, or you've been carrying around some excess weight in the form of expenses or personal spending, or you were light on dry powder and cash reserves, or you had gotten over the tips of your skis with too many fixed expenses or debt payments relative to your cash flow, or if your cash flow has been weak or negative prior to the crisis, then your ability to weather this storm financially has been compromised, and you are at extreme risk. In other words, if you have only been playing offense for the last couple of years and have no defense, then this is going to be a particularly difficult time for you, and the adjustments you will need to make will be severe. Years ago, I heard a very smart man say, how you run your business during the good times dictates how well you will survive the bad times. Maybe Warren Buffett said it best. A bad economy does not cause businesses to go broke, but it does expose the weak ones. There is no script or playbook for the current economic and business problems because we've never faced these kinds of issues with this scope and magnitude. While your specific situation might be very different than most, maybe you're in the toilet paper business, in which case none of this will apply to you. Here are a few guardrails and principles to guide you in your thinking and planning as you navigate and survive this crisis. Face reality. Whatever the environment is when you read or hear this, imagine that environment, or worse, 3 to 6 months from now. As of today, many cities, states, and even entire nations are in mandatory lockdown mode. And I suspect more is still to come, and the aftershocks will linger long after the original crisis is resolved. One of the biggest problems we all face is not knowing how long this will last. Rather than assuming extremes like it'll last forever or it's only going to last a couple days, neither of which are very realistic, you should be assuming it will last long enough and be severe enough to cause you to make radical changes to your expense structure and cash burn rate. An example might be 3 to 6 months. Maybe we'll get lucky and it'll be less. Maybe we won't get lucky, in which case we need more expense reductions and additional sources of cash. Prepare and start using a rolling 13-week cash forecast. This one tool is possibly the most important one that you can master to maximize the likelihood of survival. If you need more info on a rolling 13-week cash forecast and how to prepare one, visit my website, www.keystothevault.com/crisis-management. It's available free of charge and can be downloaded immediately from my recent article, Business Oxygen. Work out a detailed, specific plan on expenses considering your current cash balances, cash flow, and realistic anticipated revenue. The goal is to make the decisions to get to cash neutral as quickly as possible. While there are always a few exceptions to every rule, during a crisis, a business's goal is not wealth creation, but rather loss avoidance. The few businesses that are able to pursue wealth creation strategies in this crisis are businesses that have an abundance of cash and cash flow. So here it is on a bumper sticker. Not all progress is measured by ground gained. Sometimes progress is measured by losses avoided. We are in the losses avoided climate, and that means break even and cash neutral are gold medals. While I'm in favor of worst case scenario Armageddon type projections, I've found that the most valuable projection is based on a slightly pessimistic version of what you think is probably realistic, with triggers and milestones that cause additional adjustments or cuts to expenses if required. The key is a plan that is flexible and can be ratcheted or scaled to accommodate revenue or cash flow surprises. Knowing what adjustments are required if it turns out revenue or cash flow is off by 20% is critical to a realistic and flexible plan. When bad things happen, the speed, accuracy, and clarity of your response is vital. Be anticipatory versus relying on your reflexes to react fast enough to dodge all the bullets. Since we don't know what's going to happen, for some of you, it will pay to think about and plan for phased expense cuts. Sometimes you can afford to carry a loss for a while if you have the dry powder and choose to invest your capital now. On the other hand, for many people, it will make more sense to get ahead of the curve now and not try to play catch up later. You must use your best judgment about your specific situation, but every day you delay adjusting your burn rate is cash that's vaporized forever. Extreme frugality is the new mantra. Minimize expenses fast, cut fat, then muscle, and be very careful about the bone. Shedding a few excess pounds is very different from managing a broken leg. Most businesses are carrying around some excess weight that can easily be whacked. On the other hand, if you break your leg, you know you'll be in a cast for 6 to 8 weeks. When the cast is removed, the muscles will have atrophied. A month or so later, with a little bit of rehab, and your leg is just like new. But if your strategy for weight loss is to amputate your leg, or if you break your leg and the doctor amputates it for you, you will limp for the rest of your life. And the corollary is also true. It does no good to die of starvation with all of your bones intact. So be thoughtful. Here's the critical message. More often than not, the bones of a business are probably a few key employees. So here's the critical question. Who in your organization is the bone? Who are the people that if you lost them would result in your business limping after the crisis is over? The hardest expense to deal with is payroll, which for most businesses is the largest single expense on their financial statements. The temptation is to envision what we will need when the crisis abates and the recovery begins, and then stay staffed to that mythical level. The other impulse is to fund everyone as long as possible, or to enact an across-the-board 25% reduction in wages. This is usually a mistake when you don't know the length of time you'll be in the hospital. In my experience, wages need to get aligned with current revenue. This will involve some hard decisions, some hard conversations, and some serious cuts. When the recovery begins, start hiring again. This is just like rebuilding an atrophied muscle after the cast has been removed. If you stop to think about it, the people you furlough are probably the same people you'll want to hire when this storm passes. So be thoughtful about your conversations and generosity if you must push the pause button with some of your employees. Given the pervasiveness of this crisis, it's unlikely that they will find another job between now and when you start rehiring. Furthermore, everyone taking an equal percentage haircut in an effort to show solidarity, in my opinion, is equally unwise. Find and retain your A players, the bones of your business, the ones that are truly critical to keeping the doors open, either now or in the future, and protect them. The payroll cuts of 20 to 30% should be reserved for your weak or non-critical players. The question you must keep asking yourself is not, how do we maintain a full workforce, but rather, how do we survive? During bad times, break even is a win. Because once the money is spent, it's gone forever. During a crisis, it's never just the business that needs some serious weight loss. My experience is that most business owners have been overeating as well. In fact, it's not uncommon for business owners to eat regardless of whether or not there's enough food for the business. It doesn't take a Harvard MBA to understand that starving your business so you can afford your lifestyle is a prescription for an anemic business. Whack personal expenses as much as possible, as soon as possible. Be aggressive with this. Start now. Money borrowed to stay alive is money that must be repaid out of future earnings. This is not a tough concept, but it is a concept that was lost on many recent and current college students. They borrowed money to go to school because the money was available and it was easy to access. It was way easier than tightening their belts or getting a part-time job. An entire generation has learned the hard way that borrowing money now is mortgaging your financial future. The unhappy result for many of these college students is a crushing debt repayment schedule, delayed family planning, and zero ability to afford a house. Look, this is not a judgment about college students and their borrowing and spending habits, but rather an example of how any money you borrow or spend today to support a non-break-even business is money that will have to be repaid out of future earnings. So be very thoughtful, because there is no such thing as a free lunch. My experience is that while painful in the moment, tightening my belt and skipping a couple meals today is far less expensive and painful than paying the tab tomorrow for my lack of ability to design a break-even scenario. In a financial crisis, growth will not bail you out. This is not about adding new customers. This is about survival. This is the critical point. The problem we face is, how do we survive? How do we stabilize? How do we break even? How do we preserve our oxygen or cash to be able to make it one extra month or quarter if need be? How do we minimize the mortgaging of our future by being aggressively frugal today? Silence erodes trust. Communication with your team, lenders, vendors, landlord, etc. is key. In a crisis, more is better than less, while none at all is permanently damaging. Everyone who touches your business is nervous. They're nervous about their jobs. They're nervous about their accounts receivable from you, for your ability to make your next loan payment or next month's rent. You don't have to have all the answers, but you do need to be honest about the situation. They want and deserve to hear from you and to know what's going on. They need the truth. They want to know that you're working on it, and they want to know that you care. Let me give you an example. Suppose you're a passenger on an airplane and the plane suddenly drops 200 feet and starts shuddering violently, and the oxygen tanks drop down from the ceiling, and the overhead bins pop open, and luggage and handbags are flying around the cabin. As a passenger on this plane, you'd like to hear something from the captain in the cockpit that acknowledges the problem, that maybe calms you a little bit by telling you the plane is descending to a new altitude, and that the pilot knows what to do to reverse this problem and get you to your destination safely. You can do the same thing. A suggestion for a script with your employees might sound like, we've been working nonstop on figuring out how to stabilize our business, get it to break even, and make sure that we can survive. We've run numerous financial scenarios and made hundreds of different assumptions about what might happen next. Our best guess is that with X amount of revenue or Y amount of sales and the current amount of expenses, we can be cash flow neutral and break even. If things get worse, or we miss our targeted revenue, or this drags on much longer than we expect, then we'll have to make different decisions and up the dosage of our medications. This is exactly what happens when you get sick and visit the doctor. The doctor prescribes a drug or a therapy based on their assessment of the problem. If the patient gets worse, the prescription or the dosage will change. We've tightened our belts and made the cuts that we think will get us past this crisis. Our commitment to you is simple. We will keep you informed of how we're doing. We'll treat you the way we would like to be treated. We will be as generous as we can, given the circumstances we're facing. We do not have a bottomless pit of money, and we will demand everyone be frugal. We will manage this business very tightly to ensure survival and a place for you to work long term if you desire. There's no question that this is bumpy today, and frankly, it's likely to be bumpy for the next couple months. We've developed a plan that'll get us through this, and a critical part of this plan is an expectation that you will do your job at a level of excellence and intensity that reflects the severity of the crisis. This crisis will pass, and we intend to be one of the survivors. Here it is on a bumper sticker. Communicate frequently. Communicate candidly. Communicate caringly. Be mindful about your debts to a bank where you keep your operating accounts and your cash. If you have debt, the bank can arbitrarily sweep your liquid assets to offset your loan or the interest or the fees. Banks typically don't resort to this, unless they sniff a severe problem, and chances are you'd be aware of the problem before they are. To minimize this unhappy outcome of a sweep, if your business gets to the point that the problems are harrowing, set up a new bank account at a separate bank and transfer your cash and operating accounts out of the old bank into the new bank. Banks hate it when you do this, but they will all exercise the sweep, which is essentially the death penalty for your business if your situation gets bad enough, regardless of how much they tell you they love you beforehand. Although everyone is different, the rule of thumb is to be proactive in asking for a temporary moratorium on your payments to bankers, lenders, and landlords. Start talking with landlords and lenders immediately. If your cash or cash flow situation is underwater, the initial request should be for a temporary suspension of all payments for at least 90 days. This includes principal, interest, penalties, late fees, office rent, equipment leases. All lenders and landlords are aware this conversation is coming. I'm sure there'll be consequences, although the government might step in and mandate different terms eventually. But the time to deal with those and the time to deal with those outcomes and consequences is after you survive. And we get a better handle on this problem and how long it'll last and how deep it'll go. The single biggest mistake you can make right now is to freeze. If you plan to ride out this hurricane with no forethought, no plan, no shelter, no life jacket, be prepared to die. As much as I hate saying this, I strongly suspect that now that this dam of mandatory quarantine and emergency lockdowns has been broken, we will see this remedy again. So it might be useful to pay close attention to the decisions you made previously that have impacted how this crisis is currently affecting you. Anytime there's a mistake or a loss, it's critical to understand what you either did or didn't do that might have exacerbated the pain or ignited the problem. The key is to convert the pain of the loss into the gain of an education. I'm highly recommending that you start a log of lessons learned, which is simply a detailed bullet point of all the things you now know that if you'd known them before would have made a material difference in the possible prevention or minimization of the impact of this crisis. It totally changes your way of thinking about what's happened. Besides, if you don't learn the lesson this time, then you're doomed to repeat it. You can see a few of my entries in my personal log of lessons learned from losing all my money in the late 1980s by reading chapter 10 in my most recent book, The Road Less Stupid. So here's my conclusion. The businesses that are suffering the worst pain are the ones that had weak balance sheets and cash flow prior to the onset of this crisis. The focus on Wall Street has flipped 180 degrees from an obsession with income statements and revenue and scalability and eyeballs and profits to an emphasis on cash reserves, cash flow, debt to equity ratios, free cash flow. Wall Street is paying very close attention to how well positioned a business is to weather a storm and how management has performed on preserving dry powder. With the scale and scope of this financial crisis, it might be greater than any previous financial tsunami that we've ever seen. But one thing remains true. The owners and management teams who were thoughtful and prudent with running their businesses prior to these events have a significant advantage over those that ignored the rules of financial gravity. So here it is on a bumper sticker. Championship teams have world-class defenses. While offense scores points, defense wins games. This is Keith Cunningham. Thank you.